Most people in the medieval countryside were born, lived, and died within the same small patch of land. Not because they lacked curiosity or imagination, but because the world beyond the hills was not built for them. It was distant, dangerous, and deeply indifferent. Travel wasn't an adventure, it was a risk. And life, even in its smallest scope, was already full of enough danger. To be born into a village was to inherit a map whose borders were drawn in dirt, hedgerows, and memory. You might walk for miles in your life, but those miles were mostly in circles. From the door to the well, from the pasture to the chapel, from the barn to the neighbor's broken fence and back again. The outside world was rumor, a distant thunder, a story told by a cousin's cousin who had once gone to the market 3 towns over and come back with tales of buildings with 2 floors and coins the size of a thumb. But most people never saw those places for themselves. Because leaving meant more than stepping away, it meant stepping into the unknown with no promise of return. And so you stayed. Not out of fear, necessarily, but out of practicality. Out of the knowledge that survival was not guaranteed, even on the best of days, and the farther you roamed from your hearth, the more likely you were to disappear. The land you lived on shaped you. Its rhythms became your rhythms. You learned the shape of each path, the weight of each season. You could tell the time of year by the sound the soil made under your boots. You knew where the frost would form first, which trees would bud late, and which patches of ground would hold their warmth even into winter. Your life was deeply local, deeply seasonal, deeply intertwined with the whims of the earth. And when something broke that rhythm, a birth, a death, a flood, a fire, it was not just a change. It was a shift in the very story of the village. Everyone felt it. Everyone responded. Life was lived communally, not just in space, but in experience. News traveled slowly, by word of mouth, by wandering merchants, by letters read aloud in the square if someone in the village could read. And often, the news didn't concern you. A new king? Another war in a place you'd never seen? It didn't change the fact that the barley still needed harvesting and the goats still needed milking. The village was a world unto itself, a constellation of familiar faces, predictable disputes, and cyclical routines. You knew who was likely to borrow and not return, who sang when they thought no one could hear, who had the best apples and who had the best lies. And over time, you became part of that constellation too. You were known not just by name, but by role. The quiet one, the quick one, the one who always found the lost hen, the one who had once fought a wolf and won, or almost won. Memory was generous like that. There was a safety in being known, a comfort in the repetition of the seasons even when they were harsh. You knew that after the cold came thaw. After the harvest, rest. After rest, planting. Time moved in circles, and so did you. But circles have a way of becoming cages. There were moments, brief, soft moments, when you wondered what lay beyond. What the river looked like where it met the sea. What cities smelled like. What the stars looked like from the top of a mountain. You might ask these questions silently while stirring the pot or tying bundles of herbs to dry. You might ask them aloud, to a friend, to a child, to the wind. But you rarely chased them, because chasing meant risk, and risk meant hunger, and hunger meant death. Besides, who would mend the fence if you left? Who would keep the fire going? Who would gather the herbs you knew how to find, or sing the songs only you remembered? Leaving wasn't just a personal choice. It was a rupture in the fabric of the village. And so most stayed. Generations layered like sediment in the soil, each building their homes just a few steps from the ones before. Still, the urge remained. Quiet, persistent, a kind of ache that never fully left. It lived in the way your eyes lingered on the hills, in the stories you told the children, in the way you paused just a heartbeat too long when you heard the call of geese flying overhead. Maybe you thought one day, and sometimes someone did leave, a younger son with nothing to inherit, a girl whose silence had become too loud, a widow with nothing left to lose. They packed what little they had and stepped beyond the edge of the known. Most never returned, and when they didn't, no one chased them. No one asked why. They simply said they went past the trees, and that was enough. Because those who stayed understood. The world was wide, and hunger lived in many forms. But for most, the village was enough. It had to be. There was work to be done. Always. Fences to mend, wool to spin, bread to bake, children to hush, fires to feed. And in that work was a kind of meaning, a kind of rhythm that, if not joyous, was at least familiar. You learned to find joy in small things. A patch of sunlight on the wall, the way bread cracked as it cooled, the laughter of a child who didn't yet understand sorrow. A moment of stillness when the chores were done and the sky turned gold with dusk. You didn't call it happiness. That wasn't a word that lived in the village often. But it was something close. Something like peace. Something like breath. You celebrated small things. A good loaf. A dry week. A lamb that lived. You sang songs about mud and stars and cows with attitudes. You argued with your neighbor over the fence line, then shared a pot of stew later that night. Grudges were short-lived. Needs were long. The chapel bell called you to prayer. But your real prayers were whispered into fields, into hearths, into the steam rising from soup. You hoped. You endured. You believed not always in miracles, but in the power of getting through. When storms came, and they always came, you didn't run. You braced. You gathered your cloak tighter. You leaned into the wind. Because that was what life asked of you. Not escape. Endurance. And you endured. Because the village needed you. Not just your hands, but your stories. Your memory. Your witness. The way you remembered when the flood came. When the wolf came. When the healer saved the child, when the fire took the barn, you were a thread in the tapestry. Small maybe, but strong. Without you, the fabric frayed. So you stayed, and in staying, you became the keeper of something sacred. You did not live in a vacuum. For all the self-contained rhythm of the village, you were never fully free. There was always something above you. Not the sky, but someone with boots that never stepped into mud. Someone whose table never emptied. Someone who never dug the same soil twice. You had a lord. He may have lived close, a large house up the hill, surrounded by a wall with windows that actually opened. Or he may have lived farther away in a manor whose name was whispered, not spoken, because it belonged to a different world. The Lord owned the land, all of it, not just the manor, not just the forest or the stream, but the very ground beneath your feet. Even the earth that clung under your nails belonged to him. It didn't matter that your father had plowed it, or your mother had planted it, or your own back had bent to its weight. The deed bore his name, not yours. What did it mean to live on land you didn't own? It meant every harvest, every tree chopped, every bundle of reeds cut from the riverbank owed a price. It meant that work was never truly for yourself. It meant that even your breath was borrowed. And yet you carried on. The arrangement was never asked for. It was inherited like a winter coat with holes too familiar to fix. You owed the Lord your work, a portion of your crops, sometimes chickens, sometimes wool, sometimes your time. There was a word for it, feudalism, but no one used that word in the village. It was just the way things were, as constant as the seasons, as heavy as the plow. Some obligations were written down, lists scrawled by a steward who could read, folded into the ledgers of a manor clerk who could calculate precisely how many eggs your household produced in a lean spring 3 years ago. But most of it was unwritten. Understood. Expected. You owed corvée, labor, a certain number of days per week spent not in your own field, but in the Lord's. You tilled his soil while your own remained untouched. You repaired his fences while yours sagged. You gathered hay for his horses while your cow waited in hunger. No coin changed hands. And still there were taxes. If you used the mill and you had to, you paid. If you baked in the manor oven and you had no other choice, you paid. If your pig had piglets, you gave one to the Lord. If your daughter married, you paid a fee. If she didn't marry, you paid another. If your father died and left you his patch of land, you paid to inherit what you already lived on. There were taxes for using the pasture, taxes for the woods, taxes for the fish in the stream, the bees in the trees, the air in your lungs. And what did you get in return? Safety. In theory. The Lord had soldiers, men with boots and swords, and the right to use them. If raiders came or another lord threatened war, they would defend the land. Not you precisely, but the land. And because you were part of it, you were protected. Passively. In times of famine, the manor might release stores of grain. Or it might not. If the Lord was kind, you might see some bread. If he wasn't, you might see the lash. Justice came from the manor court. If your neighbor stole from you, you didn't settle it alone. You brought it to the steward who judged with cold eyes and a colder quill. The punishment varied. Fines, days of labor, public shaming, a turn in the stocks. But justice was not blind. It saw coin. It saw favor. And it rarely saw peasants as equals. The Lord himself, if you saw him, moved like a shadow through the village, riding a horse that had never known a plow, wearing clothes without patches, speaking in a language smoother, rounder, filled with words you rarely heard used among your own. You bowed when he passed, not out of love, but necessity. You removed your cap. You lowered your eyes. He was not a man. He was a station. His household ran separately. Cooks, servants, tailors, a priest, a tutor for his sons, a nurse for his infants. His table groaned with meats and spices and soft breads. His walls held tapestries thicker than your blankets. His floors bore rushes that were replaced regularly, not left to rot. If he visited the chapel, he knelt in a private pew. If he made donations, the priest spoke of him for weeks. If he smiled at you, it felt like a gift. If he didn't, you disappeared from his thoughts before he'd passed your gate. But even lords were not gods. You heard rumors. One drank too much. One beat his servants. One took the maid and left her ruined. Another fell into debt and taxed the village so hard that 5 families fled. And sometimes, rare as snow in spring, one was kind. One who lifted burdens. Who forgave debts. Who let the mill be used for free during Lent. Who walked among the villagers and listened, not just spoke. But kindness was not policy. It was an exception. And exceptions didn't last. Still, you held hope. You told stories about the good lords, about a time when justice would be shared, when land might be earned, not inherited, when the plowman would sit at the same table as the knight. And maybe those stories were lies, but they were your lies, and they helped you sleep. The manor loomed always. Its bell marked time, its steward marked debts, its fields sat fat while yours gasped for rain. And yet, you persisted, because the village was not just a place of burden. It was a place of bonds. You knew your neighbors, knew who would lend a hand when your roof leaked, Who would share eggs when your hens went dry? Who would carry your child if your leg gave out on the way home? You watched each other's backs. Not because you always liked each other, but because no one else would. You gossiped. You argued. You forgave. You stitched your days together with other people's voices. The woman who sold herbs. The old man who told stories at dusk. The blacksmith whose back never stopped aching. The boy who ran too fast and fell too hard and smiled even as he bled. This was your world. A web of obligation, yes, but also a web of connection. Tense, stretched, sometimes knotted, but strong. You knew where you belonged, and in that knowing there was power. Not political power, not coin, but the kind that lets a mother raise 3 children alone. The kind that makes a man rise at dawn despite the pain in his bones. The kind that lights a candle even when the wind howls. Because you were not just a peasant. You were a witness, a survivor, a voice in the dark. And that perhaps was more noble than any title. You woke before the sun, not because you wanted to, but because the work didn't wait. The day began not with a rooster's crow, but with the ache in your bones. A cold that had settled into your joints overnight. A silence that told you the fire had gone out. A heaviness in the air that meant clouds were waiting above the horizon. You rose in darkness. You dressed in layers worn soft by years. Your shoes were tied with scraps. Your hands already stained with yesterday's earth. Breakfast was plain, maybe a crust, a bit of broth, a few sips of watered ale. Enough to keep you standing, not enough to call a meal. The tools waited for you. Tools you knew better than some neighbors. The spade with the split handle. The hoe that leaned to the left. The rake with 3 missing teeth. You didn't need perfect tools. You needed familiar ones. Out to the fields. The land wasn't flat. It rolled and dipped and carried memories in its ridges. You knew where the rocks hid. You knew where water pooled after rain. You knew the soil that clung to boots like glue and the patches that turned powdery in heat. You didn't own the land, but you knew it. You tended it like a child who would never say thank you. The work was endless. Plowing in spring, planting in early summer, weeding, praying, waiting. Then came harvest, the season of speed, of sweat-soaked shirts, of aching hands and sunburnt necks, of days that stretched past exhaustion. You raced the sun, you chased the rain, and after harvest came preparation, turning the soil again, feeding it with what little compost you could manage, covering the beds in straw, hoping frost wouldn't arrive early. The cycle repeated. Always. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't poetic. It was routine. A long conversation with the land in a language older than words. You talked to your crops. Not aloud, but in your gestures. In the way you knelt to check a stem. In how you brushed away bugs. In how you tied stalks together before the wind could take them. You learned to read the sky. Not in charts or books, but in gut feeling. The way the birds moved. The scent of the air. The silence before a storm. The chill that came too early. You didn't pray for abundance. You prayed for enough. Enough rain. Enough sun. Enough time to get everything in before frost. You weren't alone in the fields. Children worked beside you. Parents worked behind you. Neighbors close enough to hear curses and songs alike. You didn't talk much while working. Words were heavy and breath was precious. But sometimes you sang. Old songs. Songs without owners. Songs made of rhythm more than rhyme. Songs that knew the pace of the scythe and the beat of boots in dirt. You worked through hunger. Through thirst. Through sickness. Not because you were strong, but because you had no choice. Crops didn't wait. Neither did animals. Time moved forward whether your body wanted to or not. You learned to ignore pain, a twisted ankle, a bruised knee, a finger sliced on the side. You wrapped it in cloth and kept going. And when your body said no, really said no, you sat quietly for just a moment, just enough to breathe. Then you stood again, because stopping wasn't an option. Not really. There were animals too. Cows if you were lucky. Goats more likely. Chickens. A pig. They weren't pets. They were partners. They gave milk, eggs, meat, manure, noise, life. You knew them by name. Not human names, but names that made sense. Curly, Stomper, Red Ears, Mother Hen. You whispered to them. You scolded them. You mourned them when they died. They worked too. The cow pulled the plow. The dog guarded the flock. The cat kept the mice away from the grain. Your day was measured not by clocks, but by need. When the sun hit the fence post, it was time to water. When the shadow stretched past the well, time to call the kids in. When the hens clucked loudest, the eggs were ready. There was rhythm in the chores. Gather wood, feed animals, check fences, sweep the floor, stir the pot, mend the shirt, haul water, tend the fire, braid garlic, patch the thatch, sharpen the knife. And every so often you stopped, just for a breath, to lean on a fence, to sip from a cup, to close your eyes and feel the wind move across your skin like a whisper from something older than God. Faith lived in that rhythm. Not always church-going faith, but the kind that trusted the seed would sprout, that the sun would rise, that the winter would end, that you'd survive just one more day. You did go to church when you could. Sundays, holy days, a chapel small and drafty with benches worn smooth by generations of knees. The priest spoke Latin. You didn't understand most of it, but the tone mattered. The candles, the hymns, the bells. You crossed yourself. You knelt. You listened. You confessed sins you weren't sure were sins. You asked forgiveness for things you had to do. You gave thanks for bread that barely filled your belly. You weren't devout out of fear. You were devout out of pattern. Faith was another field you tended, not for reward, but for peace. And in the fields, you found your own prayers. Kneeling in dirt, pulling weeds, you whispered things. For your child's cough to ease. For the fox to leave the hens alone. For the sun not to burn too hot this year. The land was your altar. The sky your stained glass. At night you collapsed. Not into luxury, but into necessity. A bed of straw. A blanket patched too many times. A roof that dripped if the rain was cruel. You slept with soreness as your lullaby. With the weight of another day behind you and the whisper of tomorrow already humming in your bones. Sometimes you dreamed of nothing at all. Or of simpler things, a warm loaf, a clear stream, a dry roof. You never dreamed of gold. What would you do with it? You dreamed of time, of rest, of one morning without pain. And when the rooster called, you rose again. Not because you wanted to, but because you had to. And somewhere in that quiet resignation, there was strength. Family was not just blood. It was function. It was survival. You were born into a web of obligations and affections stitched together by necessity as much as by love. Parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, if you were lucky. Siblings, cousins, neighbors who might as well have been siblings. No one lived alone. No one could afford to. From the moment you could walk, you had tasks. Not chores, tasks. Vital. Expected. Your small hands held baskets, carried wood, stirred pots, shoot chickens. You didn't ask why. You just did. By 7, you could tend goats. By 10, you knew when wheat was ready. By 12, you'd seen birth. And maybe death. There were no teenage years. No phase of self-discovery. Childhood ended when your body was strong enough to carry water without spilling. Adulthood began with responsibility, not age. Your father worked the fields unless he couldn't. Then your mother did. Or your older brother. Or you. Your mother bore the weight of more than children. She managed the household like a captain. She rationed food. She mended clothes. She soothed coughs and kept track of whose turn it was to fetch water. She remembered every face in the village, every favor owed. She rarely sat, and if she did, her hands were never still. Always spinning, darning, chopping, kneading. Rest wasn't an absence of motion, it was a change in motion. Grandparents, if alive, were living libraries. They remembered floods, famines, good years, bad ones. They told stories in the evening, not just for entertainment but to pass down survival. Which mushrooms were safe, which families couldn't be trusted, which signs meant snow. You listened even when you rolled your eyes. Because one day you'd need that knowledge. Elders were not pampered. There were no rocking chairs. No warm laps and gentle lullabies. Age was not gentle. It bent the spine. It clouded the eyes. It took the teeth and the bladder. It took faster than you could give back. But they were honored. If not always helped, then at least remembered. They were allowed to rest sooner. Their word held weight. Their silence even more. Siblings were not rivals. They were teammates. Co-workers. Sometimes competitors, yes, but overbred, not toys. You fought. Of course you did. But you also share the last crust. You knew that if one fell sick, the others would take over. That if one married and left, their absence would be felt in chores as much as in hearts. And when someone died, because they always did, the village shifted. Death was not a stranger. It was a seasonal visitor. You grew up knowing its shadow. A fever in spring. A chill that wouldn't leave in winter. A cough that deepened instead of fading. You learned the signs. The smells. The silences. Children died. Often. Babies were born in blood and screams, in candlelight and whispered prayers. Some didn't cry. Some cried for days, then didn't wake. Mothers wept and then went back to work. Fathers buried their grief under calluses. Siblings learned not to ask. But when someone lived, really lived, you held them tighter. There were no photographs. No portraits. You remembered them in gestures. In phrases they used. In the way they tied their belt. In the hum of their voice. Grief didn't pass. It settled. You talked to the dead. Quietly. At night. In the fields. At the well. You spoke to them in your head. You asked for advice. You told them you were doing your best. And sometimes when a breeze moved just right, you felt like they answered. Marriage wasn't romance. Not always. Sometimes it was arrangement. Sometimes escape. Sometimes hope. You married young. Because waiting meant danger. A woman who waited too long risked gossip. A man who waited too long risked loneliness. Weddings were not grand. A feast, if possible. A blessing. Bread and salt. Ale and laughter. Dancing that left your feet sore. Eyes that met and held briefly in the crowd. Love grew later. In the way they folded your shirt. And how they left the last bit of stew for you. In the silence that didn't need filling. You had children. Some lived. Some didn't. You didn't name them until they'd survived a while. Names were gifts, and you didn't give gifts to those who might not stay. Children weren't shielded from death. They saw it. They carried it. They helped dig graves. But they also carried joy. They laughed loudly. They chased chickens. They asked questions no one could answer. They brought wonder into days that had forgotten how to feel it. And when they grew, they took on your tasks, your burdens, your rhythm. You saw yourself in them, and also something new, a way forward. You taught them not through speeches, but example. How to hold a hoe, how to speak to the old, how to ask forgiveness, how to kneel, how to rise. And when they failed, you didn't scold first. You showed again. Your home was small. One room, maybe two. One bed shared. One hearth. One door that stuck in the rain. You cooked over flame. You ate with fingers. You cleaned with straw. There was no privacy. No secrets. Everyone knew when someone cried. When someone whispered. When someone dreamt. But you learned to live with it. To carve moments of solitude from the corners of noise. A glance, a walk to the well, a breath held before entering. You made room for each other, not because there was space, but because there wasn't. And at night, when the work was done and the fire was low and the youngest had stopped fidgeting, you lay still. You listened, to breath, to wind, to time, to everything that was held inside that small, fragile, unbreakable space called family. Life wasn't only work. Not always. There were pauses. Moments when the weight lifted just a little. When time widened enough to let in celebration, however brief, however fragile. Feast days came like breaths between heartbeats. Saints' days. Harvest festivals. Marriage feasts. The turning of the year. The longest night. The first frost. A birth. A baptism, a survival. The chapel bell rang earlier, or later, or longer, and people gathered not for labor, but for presence. You dressed in your best, which often meant the least worn thing. A shirt without patches, a shawl that hadn't faded entirely. You brushed your hair, you washed your hands twice. The village square became a place of wonder. Tables appeared. Baskets of bread, wheels of cheese, a rare jug of wine brought from the next town over. The stew was thicker, the laughter louder. You danced, not well, not gracefully, but joyfully, in circles, in spirals, with hands joined and feet stomping and skirts swirling. Even the old moved a little, even the serious smiled. Children shrieked and ran. The young found corners to whisper. The very old sat on benches and watched, eyes gleaming with a kind of memory that only movement could stir. Music came from instruments older than memory. A fiddle, a drum, a flute made from bone. And when the music stopped, the singing began. Songs with no beginning, no end. Just verses passed down like bread recipes, each household with its own variation. Songs about saints and spirits, fools and fortune, love and lard. You forgot the aches, the debts you owed in things more intangible than coin. You were just there, a part of something moving, something alive. Then came holy days, the quiet kind. You washed, you fasted, you knelt. The priest lit candles in the chapel and the village followed. The air filled with incense and breath held tight. The prayers echoed in Latin, mysterious and sacred. You didn't need to understand the words to understand their purpose. Forgiveness, hope, protection, thanks. You touched your fingers to your brow, your chest, your shoulders. You made the sign with muscle memory, with reverence, with something that felt like longing. The chapel was small, cold, drafty, but it held stories. Baptisms, weddings, funerals. You'd stood in it soaked from rain and trembling from fear. You'd stood in it with joy bubbling from your ribs. It was more than a building. It was a heartbeat. The priest was not perfect. Sometimes aloof, sometimes drunk, But he held knowledge no one else did. He read. He wrote. He held the mysteries. When you married, he spoke the words. When you died, he rang the bell. The church calendar shaped the year. Lent, Easter, Pentecost, Advent, Christmas. The days folded inward and outward again. Even time had its own breathing. The village obeyed those rhythms. Work slowed on holy days. The mills quieted. The fields rested. The oven grew cold. You might still labor, but quietly, with hands that moved softer, with words spoken only if needed. Even the animals seemed to sense it. And beyond the church, older rhythms remained. The turning of the moon, the rising of stars, the stories told by grandmothers when the fire burned low. You left a piece of bread for the house spirit. You whispered a name to keep illness away. You turned a knife beneath the table when someone knocked at night. Not because you were ignorant, but because not everything fit inside the chapel. Some truths were older than saints. When a baby was born, you tied a red string to the cradle. When a cow gave milk too suddenly, you muttered a charm. When someone died unexpectedly, you covered the mirrors. The priest shook his head, but he didn't stop you. Everyone had their own ways, and all the ways led to survival. The seasons brought their own rites. Spring, planting, blessing the seed, asking for rain but not too much, praying for sun but not too hard. Summer, tending, weeding, watching the sky, watching the wind, marking the solstice with herbs burned in a pan. Autumn, harvest, Thanksgiving with aching backs, bread shaped like the sun, tables heavy with everything you hoped would last the winter. Winter, waiting, hoping, holding your breath between snowfalls, celebrating light, Candlemas, the turning, the promise that warmth would return. Each cycle was a circle, each circle was a story, and each story was yours. You weren't just laboring. You were living inside a narrative older than you could speak. The village itself became a character. It had moods. It had tempers. It had memory. The old tree near the well remembered arguments and proposals. The stone wall near the chapel had heard more secrets than any confessor. The river bend knew where children had played and where they had drowned. The land remembered joy and sorrow. You walked its paths daily, but sometimes you saw them differently. In snow, in fog, in morning light that made everything feel holy. You knew the footprints of your neighbors, the way someone limped, the way someone else dragged a stick, the way the widow placed her feet as if afraid the earth might bite back. You belonged, not just to people, but to place. The village marked you, and you marked it. And in these shared rites, these shared meals and songs and silences, something sacred emerged. Not sacred in the church sense, but sacred in the sense that it mattered, that it held you up, that it whispered to you when the night grew long. You were not alone, not in hunger, not in prayer, not in the turning of the wheel. It wasn't always peace. For all the shared bread, the shared firewood, the helping hands, and the kind eyes, there were fractures too. Cracks in the plaster, tension beneath the surface. A village was a small place, and small places held long memories. Someone's grandfather had stolen a pig. Someone's great-uncle had refused a marriage proposal, and the wounds still lingered. Someone's fence leaned too far into someone else's land. Someone's cow drank from the wrong stream, and no one forgot. Resentments passed down like heirlooms, polished, inherited, whispered about when backs were turned. Forgiveness came slowly, if ever. You smiled at your neighbor while wondering if they were the one who let the chickens out. You shared stew with the woman who once tried to sell you spoiled milk. You asked after someone's sick child even though they'd once accused your brother of theft. Because you had to. There was no leaving. No escape. You lived elbow to elbow with those you distrusted. You broke bread beside those you resented. And slowly, over time, the lines blurred. Hatred dulled. Distrust became routine. You didn't like them, but you needed them. Gossip was currency. The baker's wife was pregnant. Or maybe not. The steward's assistant had been seen leaving the widow's cottage after dusk. The boy with the limp had stolen a loaf. Or maybe he hadn't, but he looked guilty. You didn't believe everything you heard, but you remembered it. The priest warned against gossip, called it sin, but even he listened. Even he passed on news. Quietly, carefully, as if to protect others from harm, but harm came anyway. Because in the village, your reputation was more valuable than coin. If you were trusted, people helped you. If you weren't, you starved. One false word could stain you for years. You tried to walk carefully, to speak kindly, to forgive even when you didn't feel it. But sometimes the pressure built. Arguments broke out. Loud, public, raw. Two men shouting in the square over land that neither truly owned. A woman screaming outside the chapel about debts owed and bread stolen. Children fighting with fists learned from fathers. Sometimes it ended in silence. Sometimes in blows. Sometimes in something darker. You remembered the night the shed burned. Everyone said it was lightning, but the sky had been clear. The wind had blown from the east, and the shed belonged to the man who refused to lend his ox. No one spoke of it again. There were punishments, of course. The manor court, stocks, fines, a public shaming, a quiet disappearance. You knew where the line was, but the line moved. A poor man could be punished for stealing bread. A rich one could take your daughter and walk free. Justice wasn't blind. It had eyes, and those eyes looked upward. Still, the village found its own ways to balance. When a man beat his wife too often, his neighbors stopped lending him tools. When a woman lied too freely, she found her name missing from invitations. When a boy stole, he was made to work twice as hard until the shame wore off. Not official punishments, but felt ones. The community was a net, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp. And yet, even in anger, you belonged. Even in conflict, you were held. There was comfort in that. A strange, hard comfort. Because the village saw you at your worst. And still needed you. There were moments of quiet redemption. A man who once cheated his neighbor gave his last loaf to a starving child. A woman who had lied too many times stayed up all night to nurse her enemy's fever. A boy caught stealing later built the best fence in town. People changed. Not always, but sometimes. And when they did, the village noticed. There was no privacy, but there was memory. And sometimes memory forgave. And beneath it all, the land remained. The soil didn't care if you were cruel or kind. It yielded for effort, not virtue. It fed both saint and thief. You learned to let some things go, to bury hurt in the same earth that held your crops. You learned that survival demanded more than strength. It demanded tolerance, a tolerance worn like a cloak, frayed, patched, but still warm. And sometimes, in moments of grace, that cloak became something like love. It didn't always rain, and when it didn't, the world changed. The sky turned white. Not bright, bleached. The clouds thinned until they vanished. The air grew still. Even the birds fell silent. You looked to the ground and saw it cracking. Just where there should have been grass. Wilted leaves. Crops stunted or yellowed before their time. The well ran low. The stream slowed. The animals grew thin, restless. Milk dried up. Eggs vanished. The dog stopped barking. You prayed. You looked to the chapel. You asked the priest what sin had brought this. He didn't answer. Not right away. He offered more prayer, more fasting. But still, the rain did not come. And slowly, you began to fear the sky. Then came the other side. Too much water. All at once. Storms that roared in from nowhere. Winds that bent trees like reeds. Rain that pounded the roof like fists. Hail that split the grain just days before harvest. The river swelled. The fields drowned. The road became mud. The bridges broke. The chapel flooded. The altar floated. Your home was not safe. Your firewood soaked. Your bread moldy. Your sleep shattered by leaks and thunder. And then the plague. It didn't knock. It seeped. First, a child's cough. Then a woman feverish in the fields. Then the black spots. Then the swellings. Then the silence. You'd heard stories. From merchants. From travelers. From priests. But stories were always about others. This was now. The village shifted. Doors closed. Voices hushed. People stopped visiting. The laughter disappeared first. The chapel bell rang. Too often. Too soon. You dug graves not with ceremony, but with urgency. You stopped naming the dead. There were too many. Too quickly. And you wondered if it was punishment. The priest said no. Then yes. Then nothing. He died too. No one wanted to touch the sick. But someone had to. So you did. Wrapped your face. Covered your hands. Moved like a ghost in your own home. You stopped eating full meals. You rationed food that no longer grew. You boiled herbs. You burned incense. You begged the sky for mercy. You stopped sleeping through the night. Dreams became sharp. Shouts. Flames. Empty cribs. Open mouths that no longer spoke. Some left. Into the woods. Into the hills. Into nothing. Most stayed. Because they couldn't go. Or wouldn't. Or didn't know how. Time became strange. A blur. A wait. A waiting. And then, eventually, it passed. As all things do. The sickness faded. The sky cleared. The ground dried. And what remained was silence. You stood in a village that felt thinner. Echoed louder. There were homes with no smoke. Paths with no prints. Names that were no longer called. You swept the graves. You lit candles. You tried to remember everyone, but already some faces blurred. You began again. You tilled the soil. You patched the roof. You opened the door and let light in. But something had changed. You walked differently. Slower. As if the air still remembered. You no longer asked why. You asked how. How to continue. How to forgive. How to live without those you had once braided bread with. Laughed with. Labored beside. The chapel reopened. But it felt different. Holier, maybe? Or maybe hollower. You prayed with a new kind of silence. One that didn't ask. One that only listened. And the village responded. Children were born. Crops grew again. The dog barked. A neighbor whistled. And slowly life returned. But it carried the shadow. The knowing. That all of it, joy, peace, harvest, laughter, was fragile. Borrowed. A breath away from vanishing. And in that knowing, you found a strange strength. Not hope, but defiance. You got older. It happened slowly. Then all at once. One morning you woke and your knees ached in a new way. Not from yesterday's work, but from the way time had settled into your bones. You rose slower, ate slower, moved with caution. You listened more than you spoke. You noticed things others didn't. The way birds nested early. The new cracks in the walls. The way silence fell heavier in certain corners. You no longer needed to prove yourself. You'd already done what needed doing. What hadn't been done would either be finished by others or didn't matter anymore. The fields looked different now. Not smaller, but known. Like old friends. You greeted each with a nod. With your hands. With your steps. You still worked. Of course. But you chose your tasks carefully. You knew your limits. You taught more than did. Children followed you. Asked questions. Some listened. Some didn't. You didn't mind. You remembered not listening once. You told them stories. About dry years. What years? The harvest of 22. The wolves that came. The healer who left. The spring the river turned red with mud. They laughed. Or stared wide-eyed. Or wandered off. That was fine. The stories weren't for entertainment. They were memory. Soil that carried seed. You began to think more often about endings. Not with fear, but with a kind of readiness. You'd buried enough. Held enough hands as breath faded. Watched enough eyes go still to know that death was not cruel. Just certain. You prepared. You tidied your things. You whispered names into the walls. You touched the beams of your home and thanked them. You sat with the animals longer. You kissed the children more. And when it came, however it came, you were not surprised. Maybe in bed. Maybe in the field. Maybe during a nap beneath the tree your mother planted. Maybe it was quick. Or slow. Or unnoticed. But the village noticed. They gathered. Carried you gently. Sang. Prayed. Laid you down among the others. They remembered. Your laugh. Your hands. The way you salted stew. The way you spoke to the sky before rain. They said your name. They passed your story forward. And life went on. The fence needed mending. The hens clucked. The firewood pile leaned. The world did not pause. But in small ways, it held you. The herbs you planted still grew. The child you taught still walked the same path. The words you whispered now lived in someone else's voice. The earth turned, and another was born. A child who didn't know your name but would one day ask about it. Because the village remembers. Not always with precision. Not always with clarity. But with feeling. With presence. You become part of that rhythm. The hush before dawn. The warm bread on feast day. The story told beside the fire. The shadow on the well at noon. You were never alone. Not then. Not now. And when the wheel turns again, someone else will kneel in the dirt, look at the sky, and begin the same dance. And in that dance, you were still there. Always.